Hello, I'm Tom Ferguson and welcome to The Fundamental Molecule. This show explores the intersection of water, technology, and entrepreneurship. Each week, I interview innovators, experts, entrepreneurs, and investors in the world of water, helping us understand where this trillion-dollar industry is headed. These are the stories of the people building the future of the world's most valuable and fundamental resource.
Disclaimer. Tom Ferguson is the managing partner of Virgin Island Ventures. All opinions expressed by Tom and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Virgin Island Ventures. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be viewed as investment advice or relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.
We all know about the CEO in a company. When the company is small, the CEO does everything. And when it's big, the CEO sets the vision, hires the right people, and makes sure they have what they need to be successful. But what about a layer deeper than that? Guillaume Clairet is a fascinating example of a world-class COO. Now, he's too modest to be known as the power behind the throne, but he's the guy that makes sure what needs to be done gets done. And it's an interesting time for him after both the $395 million delisting of H2O Innovation by Ember Infrastructure and their acquisition of NextEra's distributed water business. Along the way, H2O Innovation have done things their own way and have built an exceptional business. And this is a fascinating insight into the practicality of that journey. Please enjoy my conversation with Guillaume Clairet. Guillaume, it is always a pleasure to see you. How are you?
I'm very good, Tom. How are you doing yourself?
Oh, you know. So I'm really looking forward to this. I think you have a really, really interesting background across a sort of multiplicity of various experiences that I think can be extraordinarily helpful to kind of future entrepreneurs in water. But I want to start, like most good conversations do, with Erin Brockovich. It's always nice when Erin is the inspiration for people coming into this. So walk us through a little bit about why that story resonates with you. And then perhaps we can kind of segue into kind of stories in water more broadly. But let's start with the wonderful Erin Brockovich and her influence on your story.
Yeah. Well, it probably has an influence because sometimes I when people say, what do you do for a living? I say, I do water. How do you get into water? And then I say, well, you've seen the Erin Brockovich movie?
Sure.
And most people have. So it's like, okay, well, that kind of creates a bond and a link. And really, the reason I use that example is because when I graduated from university, from engineering school, I was doing some research on military training grounds in Canada because some people actually died of various diseases, but including cancer from contamination at one of the military bases outside of Quebec. And the National Institute of Scientific Research here in Canada, which I was a student and research assistant for, basically was mandated by the Canadian government to go and study all those contaminations and basically establish who else in the country was at risk of getting this nasty water into their wells and drinking it, becoming sick out of it. So long story short is that, Erin Brockovich as a movie, maybe more so than as a person, was really an inspiration from the standpoint of like, when you feel that people die because they drink contaminated water, it's just not normal. And it basically got me hooked to water. And since then I've been doing what we do and been loving it.
So how did that translate into, walk us through the origin story of H2O Innovation? What happened to put this kind of project together? Because you come a long way over the last couple of decades.
Yeah, we do. Well, actually, the very beginning was interesting because when you look at the original shell of the company, H2O Innovation was a reverse takeover. It was an RTO on the public stock market here in Canada from a mining company. So back at the end of the 90s, when mining companies that were exploring for gold and for some other minerals, mostly gold, there was this like a scandal. Remember the company called Bricks? That's another movie, actually. Gold Rush. Pretty good one. Have you seen that one?
I don't think I have, it sounds like a huge miss.
All right, download it. It's pretty good.
Oh, well.
But anyway, the price of gold went down and a lot of company crashed. And so there was this company called Ember Infrastructure that was publicly traded in Canada, and it just went literally bankrupt because the price of gold went to the worst it's ever been. And when that happened, the investors at the time of that company said, well, what do we do? And at the time, the Canadian government had said, well, we're going to invest over $500 million over the next few years for fixing small, medium-sized communities who don't have drinking water still. We're talking back at like, that's the end of the 90s, the water supplies were in very, very poor shape. That was the inception of H2O Innovation. Basically, Frederick and Guy, the two founders of the company at the time, basically said, hey, if there's no more money to be made in mining, let's just go and see what we can do into water. So the first 2 or 3 years was really partnerships with universities to develop technologies that could really be applied in the context of better serving and making safer the water in small, medium-sized, underserved communities in the various provinces across Canada. That was the start.
That's fascinating. So Frederick and Guy started with this kind of fundamental issue of like, we need to connect these communities to water. And then they were like, well, we're completely agnostic as to how we're going to do it. We're just going to go and figure it out from base principles.
Essentially. Yeah, literally. And like obviously teaming up with scientists at universities that were recognized. But yeah, it was, a business plan that was put inside an empty shell of a public company, and then basically making investors realize this was a major issue and we need to do something, and people believe in it. And so raising money, innovation, patenting, and then commercialization maybe a few years later, which is essentially when I came in. 2003, 2004 is when we had like our first sale.
So it was kind of 2003. How long into the kind of company lifetime was it that you arrived?
Yeah, 3 years, more or less.
3 years.
Yeah.
3 years. And you were the COO from the beginning, is that correct? You took on the operations role?
No, there was no such thing at the time. It was like COO, and C-suite was not a thing. I mean, remember we were in a French-speaking Quebec, so it was more like titles were just different, and we were small. I was one of the first engineers to join the team. But I was joining just as a graduate outside of university, and I think my first title was project manager. But as a project manager back then, or an engineer, you were essentially finding customers and selling them something, and then like building the stuff yourself and delivering it and starting it up. We didn't have an org chart. We didn't have all we knew is we needed to treat water, and we wanted to treat water and help communities to really solve their problem and remove, at the time, the big thing here in Canada was the chlorination of surface water and the creation of THMs, thionyl and contaminants that were created by the chlorination of water with high contents and organics. So that whole spectrum of like making people realize there was a problem, getting them a solution, proposing it, bidding on it, and then executing it. We were doing everything from scratch. There was no role. So I wasn't COO at that time, but I feel like I had responsibilities for a small team, for a small firm that were probably similar, yes.
It sounds like what you experienced was the requirement of going through all of the steps that you need to go through to actually provide a value proposition to a customer. It's kind of soup to nuts, kind of identification, design, like delivery, all the stuff the complicated things that all happen on the ground that involve kind of taking grenades and kind of figuring out your way through the morass. Like, how do you reflect on that experience in the formation of like how you think about your job now? What was most valuable to you about that experience?
I don't know. And maybe I would even like to tweak it if I may, if you allow me, Tom.
Tweak away, Guillaume. I mean, this is,
What I found most interesting, which probably is also the most valuable, is that you needed to understand the intricacies of every step from, identifying the problem statement, understanding it, resolving it, or at least making people feel like you had a strong chance of resolving it for them, and then ultimately delivering on it and just making it happen. So the fact that, you are involved in any startup, and if this is the majority of the audience, the fundamental molecule, it's awesome. But the entrepreneurs that ultimately want to succeed, they need to have a sales job, a management jobs, an operations jobs, a manufacturing job, a procurement job, all at once. So as of today, I couldn't say I'm an expert in procurement, but I know how to buy stuff, smartly, because I had to do it at the time. Now you need to structure that with departments and talented people and skill set and specialization. You need to do all that. And so when I reflect on my job today, I know very much so that like you need the experts at every discipline. But to grow from the ground up all the way to where we are today, I think that the ability to have some understanding of the intricacies of every single aspects of running a water business was fundamental.
No question. And I think we'll get onto a section of that in just a minute. But as you're building this from the ground up, as a public company, were you still answerable to the public markets, or did you feel like you were backstopped by the involvement with the Canadian government? Because like public markets can be ruthless for performance. So like, how did you think about operating under the constraints and requirements of actually being a public entity? What was that reality like?
2 phases to that, Tom. There's the pre-profit phase and the post-profit phase.
I know it well.
So when on the publicly traded companies, the public markets, they basically, will be ruthless more so after you've reached the point of generating bottom line. Like essentially, we often say getting in the dark, turning into black.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
Before that, if you're a tech company, when you have a great technology, a great team, a great story, a great vision, you're not seen the same way and nor punished the same way for lack of performing. There's sort of that period of patience on the public market. So that period, let's call it from 2000 to 2007-ish, was extremely fun, entrepreneurs and like, startup mode and very inventive, creative, all that stuff. And you reach the point where it's like, all right, guys, time to become adults. You go get a job, right? And so that's essentially the phase of like, you're starting to generate income, bottom line EBITDA. And then after that, you just got to improve your EBITDA. And so for us, the hardest part and the part you described that is very commonly spoken about, in terms of public markets and public equity investors is that part where like, if you're not able to improve your KPIs and your percentage of EBITDA profits sufficiently fast and bringing some stability and some recurrence in your revenues and all the things that we hear, that is when it's going to be ruthless to be publicly traded. Before that, and since we were there from like making $0 and losing $2 million a year, those years weren't the problems. The years were more like when you cross over that line of negative to positive, and then like from slightly positive to meaningfully positive. This is tough. This was tough. This was 2007 to 2012, 13.
So describe that learning curve for you personally. Like, how did you suit up for it? What was it that you had to become to be able to cope with that kind of period of time of the growth of the company?
Back in 2006, I moved to California, right? We had the time I'd done our first acquisition, membrane systems, with some of the best people in the membrane business, in the RO business. Paul Laverty, Ashwin Desai, great guys, ex-aeronautics guys. Paul Laverty actually had, made the first RO system at General Atomic back in the 60s. It was fantastic to be able to work with them.
Yeah, wild.
Yeah, exactly. But I was very much a technical guy. I'm a physics engineer by trade, and I had my engineering degree, and I was really good with numbers, but I wasn't like a finance guy. But when you're on the public markets, you realize quickly enough that finance is gonna drive the show. If you're gonna be a public company, you need to be able to speak finance and to deliver finance. Because we had a lot of issues and lumpiness in our revenues back in those days, because we were making capital equipment, we were selling systems, right? Like we didn't have that much recurrence in revenues. We were getting into trouble with our investors. At one point, even like not necessarily trusting that we were able to turn the corner. So you have a good quarter, then the two following quarters are not good enough. And then trust.
Even though the pipeline's there, but it hasn't realized it as yet.
So two things happened at that moment. Like it was essentially like the realization that we needed to get the business more recurring in nature. So like to essentially have customers that would be sticky and that would like pay bills like every month, ideally. That was the first thing. And the second thing is I needed to get myself educated to be able to kind of play in that crowd of financiers and speak the lingo, speak the language. So I went and did my executive MBA at the University of San Diego as I was down there. And on top of that, I started looking for acquisitions. That's when essentially I really started to be a bit of the strategic brain behind the boat to say like which targets, would fit technically with us, but it would also allow to bring some recurrence in revenues. And in 2009, we acquired this company called Professional Water Technologies, which was a chemical company. And what's great with chemicals, it was chemicals that we were using. We'd been using them for 2 years, actually, on our membrane systems to start them up. But then after we started the system, the account for chemicals would go away to somebody else or back to them. But what was great with chemicals is that, you dose a drop of chemicals every day. The system has to run for 30 years. It's going to dose some chemicals for 30 years. So it was much smaller in terms of total dollars, right? We were running after $1 million contracts, which was big at the time. But the chemicals was maybe $20,000, $30,000 a year. Well, once you've done 500 systems, if 500 systems order $30,000, $40,000 of chemicals a year, that's a big business. And that business is always there and it's stable and comes back. So long story short, long answer to tell you, Tom, that like we really went on a journey to increase our recurring revenues from essentially not zero, but very little. Like we wouldn't even monitor it. So like every year go from like 20 to 25 to 30. And every year we had goals to say we need to achieve 75% recurring revenues in our business. Today, it's actually north of 85% recurring in revenues. But that was the entire mindset. So as much as I'm a passionate water guy and I love technology and I love the fundamental molecule, we kind of tweak the business model to really be able to please and establish trust with our investor base with that whole recurring revenue model.
Because you knew you'd need it going forward.
Oh yeah,
I mean, from access to capital on down to not getting punished, right?
Yeah, it's your stock's your chance. You need to grow. You need money.
Can you walk us through the process of an acquisition as you see it? It's one of the schools of experience that I think is least understood by entrepreneurs. It's like, yeah, we could do, yeah, we could add on with this sort of inorganic growth. And then it's like, oh, then what? I'd love to hear about how you think of it. I mean, obviously this is a very, very long, potentially very, very long segment. So kind of like truncated into the sort of the highlights, but I'm just curious as to how you think about it.
Oh gosh, it could be long and I love the topic, but let's try to keep it digestible. We've done 20 deals. Not a single deal was the same. The first transaction, M&A back in 2006 was very small and so very different than the last ones, which multi-million-dollar transactions and the complexity is also very different. But some of the things that don't change, there's the obvious, which is you need a buyer and a seller. So you meet somebody, you look at their products, their company, you say, wow, this would be great. We should be together. How can we buy it? So that's where it starts. Then what are afterwards, the steps? I mean, you start by establishing the terms under which you would buy the company. And that can be called an LOI, a term sheet, heads of terms. There's different terminology attached to it. But you essentially like sit down and write on a piece of paper, how much you're going to pay and when are you going to pay it.
Just quickly, how long does that step usually take? And what are the kind of the intricacies and complexities that you've seen? I mean, I can't imagine it's always like straightforward.
So it depends. It depends. Yeah. But like literally an LOI, we've received LOI at H2O that were like one pagers and we had never met the buyers before. So it could take as much as like an hour and you send it by email. That to me, that's not the right way, but it can be 2 years of meeting frequently and talking about the potentiality of becoming, one, ultimately leading to what would that look like? Would you want to stay involved? Would you not want to stay involved? Do you want to keep shares or you want to just have a full buyout? Do you want to retire, et cetera, et cetera? But to understand what the seller is expecting can be very long. And so the process of writing the term sheet is very short. Then you have it reverted back and forth for like a month, 2 months, that would be the typical, length of process. And then you finally execute. But anywhere between a day to 2 years is generally what I've experienced to get to a point where like on paper, you have a handshake that says, this is what the deal could look like. That's only the beginning of the work, Tom, as you probably know.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Second was the due diligence. So now you've agreed that you would buy under certain conditions. And then before you close the transaction, there's the due diligence phase in parallel to the development of contractual purchase agreement.
Yeah.
Share purchase agreement, asset purchase agreement, but like the agreement to purchase. The due diligence is studying the company at a very deep level. And that's when you generally bring in consultants from outside. So when people say, I do M&A for a living, those are the guys that you basically call up and say, you're a lawyer. I need you to look up that company, blah, blah, blah. You call the finance guys or you have them in-house and they basically crunch the number, make sure that, whatever is stated to be the P&L, the profitability is actually, you do what is called a quality of earnings. And you basically run through a whole suite of questioning and visits of sites to really kind of make sure that what you think you're buying is what you're truly buying. So that's the due diligence phase. That can take, if you do it aggressively, people will say, can we do it in 45 days? That's very aggressive. More suitable would be something like 90 days. And sometimes it drags along and that 90 days become like, 100 days or whatever. But generally between, let's call it like 1.5 months to like 4 or 5 months is that phase. At the end of that phase, you basically, if you're happy with everything and you don't need to renegotiate anything, you sign a contract and then boom, the integration starts. And that's when the fun part happens. That's my favorite part. It's like, all right, let's do 1 + 1 = 3.
I mean, that was going to be my next question is that one of the most sort of, from my business school experience, the most stunning statistics that I heard in the second year was that 85% of M&A transactions fail to manifest what's on the spreadsheet, what the pro forma says. So like, how do you think about the incorporation, not only in terms of making sure that the dollars and cents make sense just in the base case, but also getting people, do you have to inculcate them in the H2O Innovation way of doing things? Like there's also a huge human aspect of it, which underlies the numbers. So like, how do you think about that integration?
Our way, and this is different for every company and for every business, but our way of doing acquisition is that we put the integration plan at the forefront of the entire process. So before the LOI, at the LOI, during the due diligence, at close and after, the integration process, how we're going to be working together, what's going to be the structure, who reports to who, what do we do with the manufacturing facility, like how the sales team work. All of those very strategic, operationally driven discussions are very fundamental to fall in the 15% success rate, which, because we went to similar business schools, Tom, I mean, the stats are terrible. I mean, whether it's 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 4, like acquisitions fail. They don't generate value. They don't generate the pro forma that was part of this. So that's a fact. How do you fall in the other category? At least I think we've done a decently good job. I think out of 20 acquisitions, there's probably only 2 that I would say we're not as good as what we thought. So, we're beating the stats on that front. And that was all based on people telling the truth to each other, being transparent, like truly focusing on that integration plan. What are we going to do with the business? And then remaining true to it all the way until a problem happens that needs to be resolved. Because if your relationships are strong between acquirer and acquiree, the acquired entity, there's no challenges you won't be able to overcome. And then ultimately you create value.
It's just a really fascinating process. I want to make a little jump here. So what does being a COO mean to you?
I don't know. I'm a pretty humble guy, Tom. To me,
I noticed, Guillaume.
To me, being a CEO is just being there and accessible and serving your company, serving your staff, helping them resolve problems and listening to what's going on, keeping your fingers on the pulse and solve problem, whatever they can be. And the CEO, in my view, is the one that provides the vision, and the COO is the one that makes it happen. That's very philosophical, but like at the end of the day, I'm just a good, hopefully sufficiently talented water professional that takes challenges and resolves them with an incredible team. So it's being a very accessible human being is probably what I would describe the most as a CEO.
That's super helpful, because I do think as you boil it down, it's just kind of like knife fight in the phone box, make sure that like all of the trains run on time in exactly what it needs to be. If so, to ask it in a slightly different way, if you were to be advising a CEO who is at the stage where, look, you haven't got a COO yet or a VP of Ops or whatever it is, how should they be conceptualizing that job within the structure of their organization? And what do you think they should be looking for in the person to take that role on?
Well, maybe I'll surprise you on that, but I would say that a CEO of a startup and small company should not necessarily be seeking a CEO. So I think that our structure as a public company is what created the need for a job like mine. In other words, if we would have been private 10 years ago, I would have told Fred, like, you don't need me. The CEO and the COO for a company up to 50 million is the same person. Now you reach a certain size and you reach a certain amount of investors that are like always wanting to speak to the CEO. I mean, the CEOs of startup companies, how much time do you think they need to spend with their investors?
Exactly. So it's not a huge like drain on their time. So they're out there obviously making the business. So there's a threshold at which it becomes pertinent. But up until that point, how would you recommend the CEOs think about this kind of world of operations? Because it does come up, right? I mean, some people solve it with a VP of Ops or like a chief of staff that has quite a kind of wide remit, even so slightly silly name, I guess. But this stuff still needs to be done. And I suppose it gets to the heart of it, which is that CEOs, they need to figure out the sequence in which they're going to put themselves out of a job. And one of the things that I think is, it's really easy to define kind of like marketing and sales, the relationship between marketing and sales, and obviously the finance and then the people side of things. But this operation seems to kind of cut across a lot of different stuff. It's much more difficult to kind of put your finger on exactly what job within operations the CEO wants to and should put themselves out of in that sequence. Any reflections there?
Very much so. Like, look, in my case, I didn't tell you about all the jobs I had before I became CEO. I became CEO in like 2015, right? So 2012, I was executive VP, which was 2012, and executive VP and CEO are essentially the same job, to be honest. Before that, I was director of business development, director of sales. I was project manager. I had different jobs at different, sequence, within the company. I would say that generally speaking, at the very beginning of a startup, nobody else can speak to the investor, so that needs to remain. Sales is so drastically important. It's the fuel of the business. So it needs to be very, very, very much involved. And then the commercial guys, if they have the potential to run more than commercial, that's also good. That's ultimately what was my journey, right? So when we think about a COO, we often think about the manufacturing, the procurement, the day-to-day. That's not always the case. Sometimes you can come from the commercial side, like I did. But I was sufficiently, I guess, technical and engineering savvy to be able to earn the trust of like an engineering crew, right? And an engineering manager who ultimately was able to speak my language, but get a lot more granular at running a crew of designers and so on and so forth. So to be more specific, to answer your question, the CEO should look at himself first and look at what his strengths are. If he's coming from the technical side, maybe the first thing he needs to hire is a VP commercial who could eventually at one point in time become CEO. The other way around, if he's a very commercial guy, very talkative, very charismatic, like we know a lot of entrepreneurs are these days, then it's the other way around. Who's your, super smart guy, the guy that like can understand Excel way more than you do and like has done like a PhD in whatever, like nuclear physics, right? Like that's going to really be the technical brain behind you. And then if you also feel that you're not necessarily super talented and super patient people, you should be thinking pretty quickly about hiring a really good HR person, somebody that's like talented to bring culture and talent, because that culture is going to be extremely important. So long story short, the CEO should be looking at himself, looking at his strengths, and basically making himself obsolete in the places that he doesn't think his personality will succeed as well as somebody else could.
That's really helpful. Thanks. Because it comes up over and over again as companies scale and kind of move into this next stage. There's an awful lot of kind of cut and thrust and blocking and tackling, just involved in like the knife fight of actually delivering a value proposition to a customer reliably. And the sequencing of putting themselves out of the job is one that I think a lot of people wrestle with. So again, to just change gears a little bit, one of the best pieces of news I've had in the last couple of years was hearing that you and Ember had teamed up. We're huge fans of Elena and Caleb and all the team, and we just think they're great. And it's really cool that they've joined forces with you. How did you think about coming out of the public market into the private market? What were the trade-offs in kind of H2O Innovation's mind?
It was a long journey. Not all of us as the partners and the C-suite sort of walked that path the same fast. I was one of the ones that actually wanted it to happen a long time ago. All
right, you won. Great.
But I think at the end of the day, what's great with the story is that we all came to the same place and very much in a celebratory mode around this is what we need to take the business to the next level. And the reason for that is it was great to be publicly traded because it made us very, very resilient. You stated it earlier. I mean, the investors can be ruthless. The public markets can be ruthless. You're delivering some great news, best quarter ever. You're stuck. The market doesn't go well. Your stock doesn't react the way you hoped. And it's like demotivating.
Sure.
Sometimes it's the other way around. Like you have, a quarter that's actually bad, and you'd feel like, oh my God, we're going to get like ripped apart and it doesn't happen as much as you do. But the long story short is it's a really good school. It makes you be thorough. It makes you on your toes. It makes you sufficiently stressed to be able to please. And you always constantly drive for performance. So that was great about being publicly traded. But after 20 years of doing that, sometimes you need to take some big swings at some very strategic moves. So, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, but the last acquisition of NextEra Distributed Water.
Absolutely.
That was big.
Other friends of ours.
Yeah?
Yeah.
What a great crew, aren't they?
Yeah.
So doing that in the context of being publicly traded would have been essentially impossible, to be honest. That's one of the great things that the acquisition or the go private with Ember basically allowed us to take some very big swing and strategic moves that under the scrutiny of the quarter-to-quarter public equity markets can't really do those bold moves as much. That's why after 20 years, when we realized like we're ready for this, we're ready for another period of very fast and aggressive growth that is only possible when you're like in sync with your main investor that really wants to support that growth. And so the moment in our history is what made it so meaningful to go that way. Because we all of a sudden could stop worrying about the quarter-to-quarter reporting financial and really focus on our customers, focus on our strategy, and just getting it done ultimately.
No, it's so interesting because if you're going to need the access to capital, you don't want to be subject to the capriciousness of the public markets necessarily, like the potential success of a rights issue and then also the scrutiny that puts you under kind of after the fact as you're actually building for the long term and making acquisitions that why you're doing it, but for some Excel jockey in wherever the hell they may be, sort of suburban Chicago or whatever, that is standing in rating judgment of you. It may not be as obvious. Yeah, that's really interesting. What can you say about your strategy? I think the NextEra acquisition, if you want to say a little bit about that and how you're contextualizing it in terms of what you're trying to build, and maybe build up from the strategy, what is this next stage of H2O Innovation's growth all about? What is it you're trying to achieve?
The NextEra deal, the distributed water deal is one that is transformational because we've always been selling products, components, consumables, or services to the various clients that need it, municipalities, industries, et cetera, et cetera. Now, all of a sudden, with the model of the distributed water is we become owners of water.
Yep.
So as much as we will never get into the regulated water business, like the American Waters and the likes, that are all our clients, getting into a mode where we will own long-term, 20 to 30 years contracts, and that we will be able to truly own the asset and take care of the asset is making us A, very stable, and B, very unique. Why? Because the contractual model that customers want is different from one customer to another. We want to remain agnostic to the contractual model. So if tomorrow Tesla says, I want an RO system and I want to pay for it, I want to be able to sell it to them. But if the day after Apple says, hey, I want to hire you for 30 years to deliver recycled water, I want to be able to say yes to them as well. Sometimes some companies are going too much to one or the other extreme. Not to name any of our competitors, but I know you know who they are. Some people will say the only thing we'll do is water as a service. If you don't want a water as a service contract, they move on to the next lead. That's it. They move on. And sometimes they will prevent themselves from having access to some of the greatest customers that you could serve as a water supply. And so for me, because NextEra was a client of ours for many years, for 10 years, they were buying systems from us, right? So we were treating them just like all of our customers, delivering them the best equipment and the best operating and maintenance service we could. But we also felt that, their clients, the dialogue they were having with their client was one that we weren't able to have, because their clients, and, one of them is a hospital, the Piedmont Hospital in Atlanta, was on the news lately. Piedmont Hospitals didn't want to have to worry about doing a recycling facility on their campus and hiring a consulting engineer and a GC and all that. All they wanted to do is to say, right now I'm paying this much for water. And tomorrow I want to pay that much. And I want that water to be a resilient source of water supply. So if there's an interruption by the city, I want to still have my water still there. And I want it to be green. So I want it to be wastewater, recycled wastewater, because it's for uses like cooling towers and stuff where I don't need to pay for expensive drinking water, and I'll leave the drinking water for the residents who need it way more than we do. So that dialogue, I wasn't able to have it before. Now we have. So at the end of the day, and this is basically links it to the future vision of H2O, is we want to be a pretty holistic, agnostic water solution supplier where there is no type of contract that we are not able to deliver to our clients. You want WPA? We'll do a WPA. You want just to buy a piece of equipment or just a piece of chemicals? We are. And that way we develop a relationship, and that relationship is what we will care for forever. Meaning that when we earn a customer, we keep it. That is our mantra. And the vision is that we would hate to be able to have to tell our customer, an important customer, sorry, we cannot do that. Go with somebody else. If you're a customer and you need a water solution, we should be able to supply it to them.
That's really interesting. It's kind of a really extreme sort of example. If the customer wants it green, paint it green. But I love this idea of, you never know where a relationship's going to go. It may start as something that's a, gross margin sale, one-off, etc. But who knows? Within 3 years, it could be some of that golden 85% recurring revenue that you mentioned earlier. I think it's a really interesting way of doing it. And actually, it's not necessarily against kind of received commercial wisdom, but there are lots of people who would disagree with you as to the wisdom of that approach. And I think probably within that actually lies the core of its value, because you know what you're about and you know what you're providing. I think it's fascinating.
You're 100% right that if you go to sales training 101, it's probably everything but what I just said. And
I mean, if
You
it
know,
works and works for you, like downstream of that is it's trust and reliability, and they know that they can throw you curveballs and you'll catch them because you guys are kind of great, and word spreads, etc.
there is some similarities with what I said and the sort of more sort of by the book sales strategy and like, extreme focus on a particular solution. Because we actually just had our first commercial summit in Quebec, like about a month ago. We had like our top, sales guys from various divisions and around the world come and dialogue around like, hey, what is it that you sell? Well, like, I sell chemicals. And what is it that you sell? Well, I sell like, $20 million piece of UFRO equipment. And they well, okay, that's so widely different. But we put them in the same room and we create synergies. And then all of a sudden we say, well, who are your key accounts? And by key accounts is like the people that like have you on speed dial when they have a water question, they call you. So those key accounts are the ones that I'm telling you that those are established long-term relationships. Those are the ones that like, yes, of course, you're going to try to gear them towards like what you think is right for them. But if you don't have it, you just let them go.
Yep.
No, I mean, this is where we say, focus on the customer's need. And if us as the, overarching strategy, decision-making entity, like the C-suite essentially says, we want to have multiple pillars to be able to serve the top customers out there with all their water needs, then it doesn't go against it actually goes in line. But you're right that if I'm talking to a sales guy, I'm not telling him to do the same thing we do at the strategic level. I'm telling him, like go and narrow down to the more like textbook version of, how to run the sales process.
Guillaume, I feel like in many ways we're just getting started. It's always such a pleasure, and I really am so admiring of what you and the team have built at H2O Innovation. It's extraordinary. I can't wait to see what this next stage of growth is going to be, especially given how good I know the crew at Ember are. But yeah, you're in a fascinating position, and you've obviously done an absolutely bang up job since your days as straight out of engineering school.
College, yeah.
So thanks so much for being here with us. This is one of our first COO points of view, and it's been absolutely critical. But our closing question to all of our guests is always the same. What is one piece of advice that you would have for current and future water entrepreneurs?
And that's a good one. And I've listened to your podcast, so I guess I should have been ready. But
still get surprised.
Pack up some patience. I mean, we all say the same. The water markets are too slow for what we'd like them to be. We'd like the water market to be as fast as Silicon Valley in the tech industry, but it's not. And it's accelerating. So that's more of like the, you're lucky that you're starting up right now and not 20 years ago when it was very, very slow, because now it's faster. But nevertheless, just be patient because it's going to work, but it's not as fast as we would all like it to be.
Absolutely.
And have fun doing it.
Yeah, people don't think too much about the value of compounding, but when you get to your position, compounding starts to look really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Fantastic. Guillaume, thank you so much for being with us on The Fundamental Molecule. We'll see you soon, okay?
Thanks to you, Tom. It was a lot of fun. Thanks a lot. Yeah, you have a great day.
Cheers, sir.
Bye-bye.
All the best.